She was standing near a window when he first saw her. Not at the center of the room, not announced, not introduced. Near the edge of things, where the light was thin and the noise of the gathering did not quite reach. She was not performing invisibility. She simply occupied the space the world had always assigned her, the margin, the periphery, the part of the picture no one bothers to name. He stopped. That is the detail that matters. In a room full of people competing to be noticed, he stopped moving and looked at someone who was not competing at all. That single pause, a breath, maybe two, is where this story begins. Not with a battle, not with a treaty, not with the kind of event that gets written into official records. With a man who refused to look away from a woman the world had already decided was not worth looking at. Her name has come down to us imperfectly, the way most names do when they belong to women who were not supposed to matter. The historical sources are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, written by men who considered her context, her station, her family's standing, the precise coordinates of her smallness, to be her entire identity. And here is what makes that fascinating. They were not unusual in thinking so. They were simply accurate about the world they lived in. She had been born into a life with a ceiling so low you could touch it without reaching. She had no title to inherit, no alliance to offer, no name that opened doors. She was, by every measure her era used to count such things, a person of no consequence. And yet, he saw her first, and he never looked away. Before you can understand what that meant, truly understand the weight of it, you need to understand the world she had been born into. Not as a backdrop, not as historical color, but as a force, a living, breathing system of rules that had been running without interruption for generations, and that had very specific ideas about who was allowed to be seen and who was not. That world will take a full chapter to describe properly. But for now, hold on to this image: a woman near a window, standing in the margin, and a man across the room, who looked at her as though the margin were the most important part of the painting. What was it that he saw? That question will follow us through this entire story, and the honest answer is that we cannot know it with certainty. We can reconstruct the facts, we can trace the decisions that followed, the ones that left marks in the record. But the internal moment, the precise thing inside him that made the world's categories feel suddenly insufficient, that is the part that lives between the documents. And that is exactly the part worth thinking about, because it is not really a historical question. It is a human one. What does it take to look at someone and see them outside the frame the world built around them? He was not a man without advantages. Let us be clear about that. He had power of a kind she did not, standing of a kind she could not access, and a name that the room recognized. But having advantages and choosing to direct them towards someone the world considered beneath notice, those are two entirely different things. The first is circumstance, the second is a decision. And decisions, unlike circumstances, tell you who a person actually is. He could have looked anywhere in that room and found someone more legible, more expected, more approved. He chose to look at the window. Can you imagine that for a second? Not the romance of it, set that aside entirely. Imagine the social architecture of the moment. Every person in that room was operating inside an invisible grid of acceptable attention, acceptable ambition, acceptable desire. The grid was not written down anywhere. It did not need to be. It had been absorbed so completely by everyone present that violating it felt not like breaking a rule, but like making an error of perception, like claiming you saw something that simply was not there. He looked at her, and, in doing so, claimed she was there, that she was visible, that the grid was wrong. That is the act this story is about. Not the love story, though there is one. Not the historical consequence, though there is that too. The act this story is about is the refusal to accept inherited categories of worth. The decision, quiet, private, made near a window, in a room full of noise, to look at a person the world had rendered invisible and say, "I see you," not despite what the world thinks, because of what I think. She was never meant to be seen. He saw her first, and he never looked away. But before you understand what that cost them both, and what it ultimately built, you need to understand the world that had spent years making her invisible in the first place. There is a particular kind of cruelty that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with violence or noise. It arrives quietly, embedded in the architecture of ordinary life, in who sits where, in who is introduced first, in whose name gets recorded, and whose gets summarized in a single line at the bottom of someone else's story. That is the cruelty she was born into. Not exceptional, not dramatic, simply the way things were, which is always the most durable kind of injustice, because it requires no villain. It only requires everyone to keep doing what they have always done. The world she inhabited operated on a logic so internalized that most people inside it never thought to question it. Worth was inherited. Station was fixed at birth. The categories were clear, they were old, and they were enforced not by guards or laws, but by something far more efficient, by the shared assumption that they were simply natural. A woman of her standing was expected to occupy a narrow corridor of possibility, to be useful, to be quiet, to move through the world in ways that supported other people's stories without generating one of her own. That was not considered a limitation. It was considered the correct order of things. To be a woman without title or fortune in that era was to exist in a specific kind of negative space. You were present enough to perform your functions, social, domestic, ornamental in the right contexts, but absent enough that your interiority, your preferences, your perception of the world around you were treated as irrelevant data. The people who wrote the histories of that period were not malicious in erasing her kind. They simply did not think to include what they had been trained to consider insignificant. And that training ran deep, through centuries of precedent, through law, through the language itself, which had far more words for the gradations of male rank than it did for the inner life of a woman who had none. Understand what that meant in practice. It meant that her intelligence, and by every account that survives, there was real intelligence there, had no legitimate channel. It meant that her observations about the world around her, however sharp, were not the kind of thing anyone asked for in a formal setting. It meant that the life she could reasonably expect was one in which she would be defined entirely by her relationship to someone else. Daughter, wife, widow. Her own name was a footnote. Her own mind was furniture. And the devastating thing is that she likely knew it. Women in that world always knew it. The knowledge was simply part of the inheritance, passed down as quietly and reliably as everything else. This is the wall he chose to walk toward, not in spite of understanding it, but with full knowledge of what it was. The social hierarchy he belonged to had given him every reason to accept its categories without examination. He had benefited from the same system that had diminished her. That is not a comfortable thing to say, and it is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past it. The people who break inherited rules are rarely people who were destroyed by them. They are more often people who were protected by them, and who, at some critical juncture, looked at the protection and found it unsatisfying. Not because they were saints, because they were paying attention. What he saw when he looked at her was a person operating at full capacity inside a space designed to make that capacity invisible. Think about what it takes to recognize that. You have to be willing to look past the frame the world built around someone and ask what is actually inside it. Most people never do that, not because they are cruel, but because the frame is so familiar, it stops registering as a frame at all. It just looks like reality. He looked at the frame and saw that it was a construction, and then he looked past it. The resistance that followed was not dramatic either, which is perhaps the most honest thing about this story. It did not come as open opposition. It came as confusion, as mild social friction, as the particular discomfort people feel when someone behaves in a way that does not match the available categories. Why her? The question was asked in a dozen different ways by a dozen different people, none of whom would have considered themselves hostile. They were simply puzzled. The grid said she was not the kind of person this kind of attention was directed toward. His behavior suggested otherwise. And the grid, for all its power, had no mechanism for processing that, except to wait and see whether he would eventually come to his senses. He did not come to his senses. He kept looking. And in a world that had written her out of every story before she could write herself in, that sustained gaze was not a small thing. It was not romantic gesture. It was a radical act of recategorization. A decision, repeated every day, that her existence inside the frame was not the whole of her existence. that the wall the world had built around her was a wall, not a law of. That question, whether the walls we inherit are laws or merely habits, is the one this story was always really about, and it is not finished yet. Most people accept the world they were handed without ever examining the terms, not because they are weak or unthinking, but because the world is heavy and constant, and it arrives before you are old enough to question it. By the time you are capable of asking whether the categories are real, you have already built your life inside them. The walls have become load-bearing. You cannot remove them without risking everything above, and so most people do not remove them. They decorate them instead, and call it wisdom. He was not most people. That is not a compliment in the easy sense, not a claim that he was better or braver in some general, admirable way. It is something more specific than that. He had developed, through some combination of temperament and experience that we cannot fully reconstruct, a habit of looking at inherited categories and asking a single, destabilizing question. Who decided this? Not as rebellion, not as philosophy, as genuine curiosity about the machinery underneath the world. Who decided that this person does not merit attention? Who decided that this station is the ceiling, and not just the current floor? Who decided, and when, and on what grounds? And are those grounds still standing? That question, who decided this, is the differentiator. Not his power, not his position, not any advantage of birth or circumstance, though he had those too. The thing that set him apart from every other man in that room, and in that era, was his refusal to treat inherited judgments as finished conclusions. Where other men saw a category, he saw a decision someone had made a long time ago that had simply never been revisited. And old decisions, he understood intuitively, are not the same as correct ones. They are just old. Time is not evidence. Repetition is not proof. This is the transferable lesson. This is the part of the story that belongs to you, not just to him, because the specific historical circumstances of his life are not replicable. The time, the place, the particular social architecture he moved through, but the cognitive habit is entirely replicable. The practice of looking at a wall and asking whether it is structural or merely decorative, whether it is a law of or a convention that outlived its original justification, that is available to anyone. It costs nothing to acquire. It costs a great deal to practice consistently, because the people around you will often experience it as a form of aggression, even when it is only curiosity. Consider what he actually did, in concrete terms. He directed sustained, serious attention toward a person that the social logic of his world had classified as not worth sustained, serious attention. He asked, implicitly, what she thought, not in the performative way that powerful people sometimes ask questions they do not intend to hear answered, but in the way that signals genuine interest in the answer. He treated her perception of the world as data worth collecting. That sounds almost mundane when you describe it plainly. In the context of the world they both inhabited, it was a form of defiance so quiet it registered as eccentricity rather than revolution. But quiet defiance, sustained over time, reshapes things just as surely as the loud kind. She noticed. Of course she noticed. A person who has spent their entire life being looked through develops a very precise sensitivity to being looked at. Not the performance of attention, the social smile, the polite inquiry, the gaze that lands on you and immediately begins composing its exit. Real attention, the kind that waits, that listens past the first sentence, that remembers what you said 3 conversations ago and connects it to what you are saying now. She had not been the recipient of that kind of attention before, not from someone with the standing to offer it without social cost. And she did not mistake it. She received it with the wariness of someone who has learned that unexpected gifts often have complicated origins. What was she thinking in those early moments? We cannot know. The record does not preserve her interiority with any reliability, which is exactly the kind of erasure the previous chapter described. But we can reason about it. She was intelligent. She was observant. She had spent years in a world that required her to read the room accurately for her own navigation, because the penalties for misreading were borne entirely by her. She would have understood what his attention meant in social terms, what it cost him in the currency of expected behavior, what it said about his willingness to absorb that cost. And she would have weighed it carefully, because careful weighing was one of the few forms of agency her world permitted her. And here is where the mirror turns toward you. You live in a world with its own inherited categories of worth, its own invisible grids of acceptable attention and acceptable ambition. The specific walls are different. The logic underneath them is identical. Someone, somewhere in your life, has been classified by the world around you as not worth the serious attention you are capable of offering. An idea dismissed before it was examined. A person rendered peripheral by consensus rather than evidence. A possibility written off not because it failed, but because it was never attempted. The question is not whether those walls exist in your life. They do. The question is whether you have ever stopped to ask who built them, and whether the person who built them knew more than you do. There is a fantasy we carry about being chosen by someone powerful, that it resolves things, that it lifts you cleanly out of the life you were living and sets you down somewhere better, somewhere safe. The fantasy is seductive because it contains a partial truth. Being seen by someone with the standing to act on what they see does change things. It changes the room you are allowed to enter, the conversations you are permitted to have, the possibilities that become technically available to you. But the fantasy omits the friction. It omits the weight of every person in that world watching you step outside the category they assigned you, calculating whether you deserve the new position, waiting for the evidence that you do not. She did not get to simply receive his attention and be transformed by it. She had to carry it, and carrying it meant absorbing, every day, the quiet skepticism of a world that had very clear ideas about what she was and was not. The looks were not hostile in any dramatic sense. Hostility would have been easier to name, easier to push back against. They were subtler than that. The slight recalibration of a conversation when she entered it, the pause before her opinion was solicited, the specific kind of attention that monitors rather than listens. She was being watched for signs of overreach, for evidence that she had misunderstood her elevation and begun to mistake it for belonging. He watched all of this happen. That is the part of the story that is easiest to sentimentalize and hardest to look at clearly. He had initiated this. He had directed his attention toward her, had acted on what he saw, had set in motion the social consequences she was now navigating, and she was navigating them in a body and a station that absorbed those consequences differently than his did. The cost of stepping outside a category is never evenly distributed between the person who breaks the rule and the person who was the subject of it. He paid a social price for his choice. She paid it in a different currency, at a different rate, without the option of simply deciding to stop paying. And yet she did not retreat. That is the detail that tends to get lost in stories like this, where the person with the power to act gets cast as the protagonist and everyone else becomes supporting evidence for their virtue. She made choices too. She chose to remain visible in a situation that would have forgiven her for becoming small again. She chose to speak in rooms that had not invited her to speak. She chose to hold the position she had been placed in with enough steadiness that the people watching for her collapse eventually had to stop watching. That is not a passive act. That is a form of will that the historical record rarely names as such, because it does not look like conquest. It looks like endurance. But endurance, chosen deliberately and maintained under pressure, is one of the most active things a person can do. The resistance they encountered together took several forms, and it is worth being specific about them. There was the social friction already described, the monitoring, the skepticism, the ambient disapproval of people who felt that the established order was being handled carelessly. There was also something more personal, the specific discomfort of people who had known him before, who had built their understanding of him on the assumption that he operated within the expected parameters, and who found his behavior newly illegible. When someone you thought you understood begins making choices that do not fit the model, you have two options. You can update the model, or you can decide that they have made an error and wait for them to correct it. Most of the people around him chose the second option, at least initially. What sustained them through that period was not romantic certainty, not the clean, narrative confidence of two people who simply knew. It was something more workmanlike than that, and more durable. It was the ongoing, repeated decision to trust their own perception over the consensus of people who had not looked as carefully. He had looked carefully and seen someone the world had dismissed. She had looked carefully and seen someone willing to absorb real cost for an unfashionable conviction. They were both, in their different ways, practicing the same cognitive habit described in the previous chapter, the refusal to treat inherited judgments as finished conclusions. They applied it to each other, and in doing so, built something the world around them could not easily categorize. The price of being seen, it turns out, is not paid once. It is paid continuously, in the small daily transactions of a life lived outside the assigned lane. Every morning you wake up in a position the world did not build for you. You have to re-choose it. The drama is not in the original act of defiance. The drama is in the maintenance of it, in the quiet stubbornness of continuing to occupy a space that was not offered to you, across months and years, and the accumulated weight of everyone who is still waiting for you to come to your senses. She understood that. He understood it too, and what they built inside that understanding is what the final chapter is about. Legacies are strange things. They do not always look like what they are. The ones that get recorded cleanly, the victories, the monuments, the names carved into stone, are easy to trace. You can point at them. You can build a narrative around them that moves in a straight line, from cause to effect, from decision to consequence, from person to impact. But the legacies that matter most are often the ones that do not photograph well. The ones that live in the changed perception of a single person, or a small group of people, who went on to change the perception of others, in a chain too long and too quiet to document fully. Those legacies are harder to see. They require the same kind of attention this story has been about from the beginning. What they left behind was not a monument, it was a proof of concept, a demonstration, enacted across the span of a real life, that the categories the world uses to assign worth are not natural phenomena. They are administrative decisions made by people who are no longer alive, enforced by the habitual compliance of people who never examined them. She had been classified as invisible, as marginal, as a person whose interiority was not relevant data. He had looked at that classification and found it insufficient. And then they had both, together, maintained that position under sustained pressure for long enough that it became undeniable. Not celebrated, not universally accepted, not free from cost. Simply undeniable. The wall had not fallen, but it had been demonstrated to be a wall, which is the necessary first step toward any wall falling. The historical sources that survive are, as noted at the start, fragmentary. What we know with confidence is partial. What we infer is reasoned but not certain. And here is what makes that irrelevant to the lesson. The specific biographical details were never the point. The point was always the structure underneath them, the cognitive habit, the repeated decision, the refusal to outsource your perception to the consensus of people who are not paying attention. That structure does not depend on the precise dates or the exact sequence of events. It depends on the recognizable human pattern, which is preserved clearly enough in what we do have. A person was rendered invisible by the world she was born into. Another person looked at her and saw what the world had missed. That is not a historical curiosity. That is a template. And templates are only useful if you apply them. So let us be direct about what that means for you, sitting here now, in a life that has its own inherited categories and its own invisible grids. Every one of us carries a set of walls we received, rather than chose, limits on who we are allowed to become, on what kinds of ambition are considered appropriate for someone of our particular starting position, on whose attention we can reasonably expect, and whose is considered above our station. Most of those walls were built by people who are long gone. Most of them have not been examined by anyone in your immediate vicinity. They are simply there, load-bearing by habit, rather than by structural necessity. And they will remain there for exactly as long as no one thinks to ask who built them. The question is not whether you can see the walls. You can. Everyone can, if they look directly at them rather than through them. The question is whether you are willing to do what this story describes, to direct sustained, serious attention toward a possibility that the world around you has classified as not worth sustained, serious attention. To ask about your own life and your own perceived ceiling, The same question he asked about her. Who decided this? Not rhetorically. Actually, who decided that this is where your story ends? That this is the category you belong to? That the margin is your permanent address? Was it someone who knew you? Was it someone who examined the evidence carefully? Who looked at what you are actually capable of and made a reasoned judgment? Or was it simply the accumulated weight of a world that classifies first and looks later, if it looks at all? She was never meant to be seen. That was the verdict of a world that had processed her through its categories and arrived at a conclusion before it had done the work of actually looking. He refused to accept the verdict. Not loudly, not with a manifesto or a rebellion, but with the quiet, persistent, daily act of continuing to look at what the world had decided was not worth looking at. That refusal, small in the moment, enormous in its cumulative effect, is the thing worth inheriting from this story. Not the romance, not the drama, not the historical detail, the refusal. The world is still full of people who have been told they are not meant to be seen. It is full of ideas dismissed before they were examined, of possibilities written off by consensus rather than by evidence, of lives constrained by walls that have not been load-bearing for generations, but that everyone keeps treating as though they are. The question this story leaves you with is not about them, it is about you. You already know how to look. The only question that remains, the one that does not have a historical answer, only a personal one, is whether you are willing to stop looking away.